Ladies and gentlemen, listeners to the HPANWO show on HPANWO Radio. I've got another guest back. He's been on a few times before, and he's on again. It's Mark Devlin. Hello, Mark. Welcome back.
Hey, Ben. Good to be back, as ever.
Oh, mate, good to have you back on. How's things with you?
Well, lots going on at the moment, as always. Busy with work stuff, holding down a day job, handling family business. I am actually moving home, or in the process of, so that's always stressful and loads to deal with. And then just holding down all my other activities. I'm keeping the podcast going. I've got the new book out, so I'm promoting that. I'm doing some talks. I'm going to Australia next month, believe it or not. Oh, nice. So, one or two things happening in my world.
Hey, well, you're a busy chap, and along with all that, you've got time to write books. It's amazing. But you have written quite a few books, and indeed I've read one of them, and you've just come out with a new book. It's called The Cause and the Cure, and it's different from your others in several ways. First, it's fictional. Have you actually written fiction before? This is your first ever?
It is my first stab at fiction, yeah. I was partly inspired by you, because last year we shared a merchandise table at the Alternative View conference, and I was peddling my wares there, which was my musical truth books, and you were peddling your trilogy of novels that you've put out.
Possible, yeah.
And I sort of glanced with curiosity over at those and thought, that's an interesting idea. So yeah, just the fact that you come from a similar background to me in terms of the research that you do and the shows that you put out, and the fact that you had expressed yourself through fiction creatively in that way made me think, maybe that's something I need to look at. So yeah.
Oh, cool! That's great. I didn't realise I'd inspired you, but that's wonderful.
Oh yeah,
I'm really pleased. I'm really honoured. So yeah, this is. I mean, I did wonder about your fiction because, like, non-fiction authors. I mean, I've known an example is Graham Hancock. Now he's a very prolific non-fiction author, and I've read most of his works. He then switched to fiction, and
that's right.
I sense I could actually tell. I mean, he wrote a book called Entangled, which actually is not a bad book, and I enjoyed it, but I could sense an unripeness in his style. I sensed that you could tell he was new to fiction. But with you, I mean, I think your style does have some maturity in it, so I just wondered if you'd actually tried this before, even if you'd just done it privately. I mean, is this your first ever?
I haven't. The only books I'd written previously were non-fiction, so this is my fourth book. The first one came out in 2007, way back in the day, and it was called Tales from the Flip Side. So this was a collection of anecdotes and funny stories from the sharp end of the DJing game, based on my years being out there as a working DJ. And back in 2007, I was still fast asleep, snoring in the Matrix, wallowing in ignorance and spiritual darkness. So it wasn't until a couple of years later that I woke up, in inverted commas. And then I put out the 2 volumes of Musical Truth in 2016 and 2018. So this is the fourth book. And I consider it to be very cinematic. I mean, you've read it. I don't know if you got that from it, but there are many scenes in the narrative where I can just picture a film version of it, and I can imagine actors going through the motions, and I can imagine the locations and stuff. So in writing this, I was very much inspired by my love of film, because I'm a bit of a film buff. I'm very picky in my tastes in terms of what films I like, so I'm not someone that watches every blockbuster that comes out. I only like particular types of films or particular directors' work. But the films that I do love, I'm quite obsessive about. I love the work of Sergio Leone, who I think is probably the best director of all time.
The westerns.
The spaghetti western trilogy, so-called, although there's so much more than that. There's so much subtlety to his work. And then Stanley Kubrick, of course, the absolute master, the genius himself. And many other directors. David Lean was a great director as well, way back in the day. So the work of these types of individuals really inspired the writing of the book, and there are a lot of cinematic elements to it, not least the fact that, something you picked up on, it's got its own soundtrack, and this might actually be the first novel to come with its own soundtrack.
I think it is. I've not heard of another example of a book with a soundtrack, because you do have a list of tunes, and indeed you refer to them actually in the text, but also in the end notes and things about what you can actually listen to while you're reading this. And I mean, you and I think of a similar generation, and I won't say exactly what generation, but I so identify with the setting, the early 90s Oxford. and the age you were at that time,
sure,
and the way it looks, and the age the characters, well, Verity and the other younger characters were. And I know cinematic is. I mean, I do know what you mean by you create a book and you can visualize it in your head, and I've done this. And for example, the moment Nomas appeared, I saw him immediately as Colm Convey, the Irish actor. Do you know Colm Convey?
Yes, I know who you're talking about.
He tends to play bad guys, and he just fits so well. He just fits so well into that character.
Yeah, that's a good observation. I had Roger Allam in mind. Do you know that actor?
Yeah, that would do quite well as well, I expect.
Yeah, he's in Endeavour. He's Morse's boss. And, he's been in many other things. I actually did a Facebook post a couple of weeks back of pictures of actors that I could imagine playing the parts of the various characters. And when the recent drama on Christine Keeler came on TV, the girl that's playing Christine, Sophie Cookson, I had in mind as May Pierce, the female copper that I've got in the story, who's kind of a secondary heroine to Verity. And there's a girl that plays, now what's her name in EastEnders? Chantel. The actress's name is Jessica Plummer, and I had her in mind for Verity. So I've got these certain actors in mind, and I can imagine if ever there were a film treatment of the book, there never will be, but I can imagine, then these are the actors that I can see playing the different parts.
You never know, Mark. If someone, you never know. Someone, especially maybe some local filmmaker. I think a local filmmaker in particular might be. It'd
be incredible, wouldn't it, if that could happen?
Yeah, but I mean, I was. The book is really quite. It's like a puzzle. It's like as good detective stories are. It's not just a story; it's an interactive experience. So I noticed immediately you were bringing. I noticed there were things that I thought might be clues. For example, the moment you described Verity's car, you mentioned the number plate, and I thought that's an odd detail to include. And I made a little mental note of that, and I thought,
okay.
And it's just subconsciously, but later on, of course. It comes up again. She's living at house number 216. She arrives at the Barton Pirate Station at 2:16 p.m. and things like that.
That's right. The thing about the number plate is it's based around a car that my dad used to have back in the 70s. And I think it was a Marina, Austin Marina back then. And I can remember the number plate. It was BBP 198G. So this is a variation on that. I made it BBP 216. I forget the last letter, actually. Somebody told me what 1978 was, what the letter was for that year. It's whatever I put in the book, because I wanted it to be a 1978 Mini, because I had a 1978 white Mini. So Verity's car is the car that I had up until December 1988, when I turned it over on the A40 just outside Oxford, Wheatley, coming back into town, when I fell asleep at the wheel. The sins of my youth. I was 18, I'd been working all day, out all night partying, and I fell asleep at the wheel and could have died, clearly didn't, but I wrote the bloody car off. And then Keith's car that you get in the book is a sort of silver blue Austin Maestro. Maestros were very much on the road in 1990, and that was my second car. So after I wrote the Mini off, I went out and got a Maestro. So those two characters' cars are my cars from back in the day. There's a lot of autobiographical stuff in there. I've even got an Alfred Hitchcock-style cameo, so I actually appear in the narrative as I was in 1990.
The guy that everyone says, "What's his name? What's his name?" Like that young chap.
Exactly.
And I also noticed Howard Hughes gets a cameo too. I thought that was very amusing.
Yeah, Howard Hughes of the Unexplained fame. He's got his podcast now, but he was an IRN newsreader back then, and he had a very distinctive voice. The 11 o'clock news. I'm Howard Hughes. You knew him when you heard him. And back in 1990, he was doing the IRN bulletins, so I just stuck him in there. I think there are 3 real-life characters that I can think of that appear. So there's Howard Hughes, who appears in voice, and then there's Bill Heiner and Bill Reynolds. The late Bill Heiner and Bill Reynolds, I think, is still around, and those two guys work for BBC Radio Oxford. So they appear in a cameo in the Randolph Hotel scene where there's the Rotary Club ball. They're just sort of hanging in the shadows. So I just threw those in there for some extra Oxford references.
Actually, you can't actually have some kind of posh Oxford do without Bill Heiner turning up. I mean,
seemingly so.
He's the sort of gown. He's the sort of town side to the gown, I would say. Whenever the people from the university sort of get together, like they have to have a townie in there, and they usually choose Bill Heiner because he's sort of like he's the most prominent person. But he actually, my mum used to work at the Phoenix Cinema, and but she didn't get on with him. But
oh right.
she didn't get on with him particularly because he used to own that cinema. I think it's someone else now, but that's where we saw Doctor Strangelove.
Well, that's right. Good. Yeah, last year. Yeah,
and I think you might have taken some inspiration from that because the naming of the characters is very interesting, as indeed it is in that film we saw, because the names all have meanings, or they're sort of funny, or they're either humorous, or they have some kind of
you had
meaning.
General Ripper in that film, didn't you?
Yes, Jack D. Ripper.
Jack D. Ripper, that's right.
And you have all kinds of... You have, there's C.C. Nomas, we've mentioned, the chief of police, the chief detective.
Yeah.
And, it's an anagram.
Did you get the coding on that?
Yes, it's an anagram.
Well, it is.
Listeners can work it out. I'm not going to put spoilers in here, but listeners can work out what C.C. Nomas stands for.
Yeah, that one's an anagram. Some of the names are anagrams. In the foreword at the start of the book, I've mentioned that anyone that wants to go clue hunting and deciphering the coded layers of the book, because it is done in layers. And I mentioned that if you want to read it as a straight thriller, a murder mystery, then you can get that out of it if that's the type of book you enjoy reading. But if you're someone that likes digging beneath the surface and looking for hidden elements, and again, this was inspired by the likes of Stanley Kubrick and all the incredible amount of the treasure trove of clues that he was able to encode into the narrative of his movies. With Stanley Kubrick, you can watch one of his films 8 or 10 times and still find new things with every viewing that you missed on previous ones. So I really wanted that to be the case with this book. So I've coded loads of stuff into it. And I think if you do read it 2 or 3 times, you are going to spot things that you didn't decipher the first time round. But one of the most obvious elements of it is the character names. They're all coded and they all mean something. With the exception, there's just a couple of the journalists in the radio station and a couple of the DJs. Don't go hunting for clues in their names because they don't mean anything, but the vast majority of characters do. So some are anagrams, like Nomas, and others tell you something about the true nature or the personality of the person concerned. So an obvious one is Verity Hunter, who is the main character in the story, and I'll break that one down because I'm sure people have spotted it anyway. Verity is derived from the Latin word veritas and the French word vérité, which means truth, and Hunter, someone who hunts, is obviously someone who seeks something, so she's a truth seeker. Her name literally means truth seeker, and in the story she's someone that undergoes the process of waking up, in inverted commas, and coming to terms with the truth of what's really going on in this world. And you follow her journey through the book from a normie to someone that has, spotted what's really going on. So that's an obvious one, but all the other names are coded as well.
It's nice, actually, that she and indeed Mae Pearce and Keith, these people are... in a sense, portrayed in a way you don't see often in fiction. In other words, what they're doing is considered something noble. It's a heroic thing that they're doing by getting to grips with the truth. Whereas, of course, in most fiction, they'd be regarded, they've lost their minds. They're crazy. They start believing conspiracy theories. They must be nuts.
That's right. And this book is set in 1990, so we're on the 30th anniversary now. And there weren't very many people around of that ilk in 1990, because this was obviously pre-internet and it was pre-conspiracy culture. So there were very few people like Keith and his mate Phil. They're portrayed in the story as a couple of young guys. So they're 24, they're college buddies, and they sit around spending their time listening to this consciousness guru called Max Zeal. And Keith has a bunch of books on his coffee table from the likes of Jim Mars and James Billington. In 1990, this was just before Bill Cooper had dropped Behold a Pale Horse. Otherwise, I would have got that one in there as well. And it was the year before John Coleman put out the Conspirators Hierarchy, the Committee of 300. And also it was the year before David Icke appeared on that famous Wogan interview and started putting out his books, and everyone had heard of David Icke. And he had become a household name for very different reasons to what he was before, when he was a sports broadcaster. So in 1990, Keith and Phil are sitting around reading these books, listening to cassettes from Mae Brussel, and that's a very unusual thing, because most young guys back then would have been out playing football or going to the pub or pulling women in clubs, and these two are there working on their spiritual knowledge and their consciousness and studying hermetic principles and all this. So it's quite an unusual scenario, but I think that's something that makes the story distinctive. Another thing about Verity Hunter's name is that the radio station that I've set this in, Lux FM, is a fictional radio station, but I'll tell everyone that it's based very much on the radio station that I worked at in Oxford back in the day. I was there from 1990 to 96, which is why I start the story in 1990 and the epilogue is set in 1996. And this station was called Fox FM. Interestingly, Fox equates to 666 in gematria, which I had no idea of at the time. So Lux FM is a thinly veiled reference to Fox FM. And the managing director of that station when I was there was a guy by the name of Tom Hunter. So I've been able to weave his name into the character of Verity. And also there was a DJ working there by the name of Mark Zeal. Real name.
I remember, yes.
You remember him, yeah?
I think so, because the Fox FM, anyone who lived in Oxford will know Fox FM. I mean, I think they ended around 2000 or so.
Yeah,
but they were literally the soundtrack for the city. Night shift in the Porter's Lodge, Fox FM and beyond. And everyone stopped listening. Radio Oxford sort of became SEP and the BBC station. And we all went over to Fox FM. And we had that Canadian lady. What was the name of that Canadian
Brenda Mercer.
lady? Yeah, she was great. She was
a good friend of mine. I used to produce a show that came live from the Park End Club, which also gets a mention. That didn't open until 91, but part of the story is set in 91. And I used to produce this show that came live from the club, and Brenda was, hosting down there. And I always used to go down the club afterwards, and for the last couple of hours, I would just rave, because I was a bit of a raver back in the day. And
I wonder if we met. It's just back then, because I was as unconscious as you were back then. I was vaguely interested in the paranormal, but I wasn't like I am today. I certainly wouldn't be listening to Max Zeal, but I did go to, I'm night shift, 10 p.m., finished the night shift, back to the staff accommodation. I went home, changed into our clothes, head off to the clubs and everything. It was a tradition on the E shift of the Porters. But now I'm getting nostalgic now. There is nostalgia in this book. Just the description of Keith and his mate listening to tapes. This is people much younger than us wouldn't understand. They wouldn't even remember this. But you if you wanted to listen to a guy like Max Zeal in those days, you couldn't go online. There was only like Usenet and things, which were useless. You literally have to send off mail order, and they'd send you cassettes.
Absolutely.
You couldn't go to YouTube. You had to get the cassettes physically and play them on a recorder, on a player.
That's how Mae Brussel used to do things. She was a pioneering conspiracy researcher long before David Icke and Bill Cooper and any of the others. She was active from the 1960s through to the 80s. I think she died in the 80s. But right off the back of the Kennedy assassination, she became a conspiracy researcher, and she compiled a mailing list, and it was literally mailing, going to the post office and putting stuff in the mail, and she would send out cassettes. She would sit there and record cassettes and put them in the post and stick stamps on them. Imagine that. These days you just download a podcast, but that's the way you had to do things back in the day. And this story is a bit of a sort of love letter to past times, which are now lost, a bygone era, pre-internet, when you had to do things like go to libraries and get books if you wanted to research things, and turn up at lectures in, conference halls and actually listen to this information being delivered live, because there was no such thing as the internet back then. And I make a lot in the story of the characters utilising the technology of the day, particularly in the radio station. You've got the journalists in the newsroom hammering away at typewriters and ripping out sheets of A4 paper, which is the way things were done when I worked there. And they're recording stuff onto reels of tape. And when they play the jingles and the ads on the radio station, they've got these cartridges, which are loops of tape in these plastic casings. So nothing was done on computers. The daytime DJs on the radio station back then used to play records, vinyl records. They would queue up a 7-inch single on the turntable and play the music off of that. It's unimaginable for people these days, but only 30 years ago, this is how it was all being done.
It's incredible how things have changed. Your unnamed namesake in the book is one of his jobs is actually to get these cartridges out and take them to the studios and then delete them afterwards and things like that.
Which was my job, yeah. You had this magnetic erasing device, and you'd have to shove the cartridges in there, and there's this magnetic field that would wipe the tape clean of the audio so that you could reuse it. And if you didn't take your watch off when you shoved your hand in, it would bugger up your watch, which happened to many
magnetic
people.
Fields, yeah. Powerful magnetic field, yeah.
Very real thing.
Oh, I think it will appeal probably to people of our generation, but also younger people who are interested in the past. And if you're interested in conspiratorial history, this is a great book because you have given a vision of the past, like you just said. I mean, I've never heard of Mae Brussel, but I know Anthony Hilder, Dave Starbuck, and these people, they used to do exactly that. And it's before the internet. People just used other things before the internet. They did the same things. They listened to audio, but they just did it a different way. It's amazing.
You've also got characters fishing around in their pockets for 50p pieces because they're out in the street and they need to make an urgent call. You couldn't just take out your mobile phone because very few people had one. They were still the size of bricks back then anyway, but they were very expensive and most people didn't have one. So if you wanted to make a call, you had to use a public phone box in the street and you had to put coins in it.
It seems amazing, isn't it? It's just people say, "Hey, what's that?" Anyone younger than us is going, "What's he talking about? What is this?" Yeah. Read the book. It's history, guys. It's history. It's great. But I was. I mean, I remember that era, but I was not like I am now, like yourself.
And isn't it shocking? I mean, 30 years is not that long ago, Ben. Really, in terms of the way human history has played out, it's just the blink of an eye. And yet, look at the way we live our lives now and the technology that we utilise and how it was just 30 years ago. I mean, the entire world has just changed so much since then.
Yeah, it makes you think in 30 years in the future, what will things be like? Because, I mean, you and I probably have a good chance of still being alive then.
I do hope so, yeah.
I hope so, yeah. And we'll have to wait and see, I guess, won't we?
Well, we will, yeah. But that's one of the elements that I did want to get into the book. I specifically wanted to set it in 1990 because I did want to draw parallels between the way people lived their lives back then and what they're doing now. And I've got some real-world events in there as well to give it some authenticity. So there's references to things that were in the news in 1990, 91, specifically the first Gulf War / invasion, when Saddam Hussein supposedly annexed Kuwait. And George Bush, the elder, who was the US president at the time, launched military strikes against Iraq as a result. And, of course, Britain followed in its wake, like the obedient lapdog that it is. John Major took over from Margaret Thatcher as British Prime Minister at the end of 1990 because Thatcher was ousted by her own cabinet. So she was kicked out of office in November 90. So I'll make a reference to that. All through 1990, you had this consternation about the poll tax in Britain. There were riots and public disorder based around the immoral poll tax. All taxes are immoral, of course, but people got up in arms about this one, and that was one of the reasons why Thatcher was kicked out. So I've got references to all this as well. So anyone that remembers life in 1990-91 is going to be familiar with all of that. And then anyone that was in Oxford, as we've mentioned, there's plenty of local references, including the opening of the stretch of M40 between Oxford and Birmingham. So that happened in January 91. I remember it well. And I don't know if you did this, if you were in Oxford at the time, mate, but straight after that stretch was open, I used to go, when I was coming back from London, I would just go tearing straight up that new stretch of M40 when I had intended to turn off to Oxford because I wasn't used to making the turn off on the M40. And everyone I know did that.
They reorganised I mean, I never drove on it myself, but they reorganised the roundabout and the junction. So it was easy to miss it and have to go all the way up towards Pear Tree. I remember.
Yeah. Well, you'd end up going to Junction 9 and then have to come down the A34 to retrace your steps. And everyone I know did that. Everyone in the radio station made that mistake.
Yeah, and that's right. Cause it's quite a long way. Because Pear Tree is actually south of there, to the north end of Oxford. That's where the A34 meets the Oxford Ring Road. And it's right. These things. I mean, these are some things that actually Inspector Morse, the TV series, gets wrong. Is not including these local pieces of continuity. For example, Morse could be driving out of South Parks Road one minute, and then he's sort of turning into Oriel College the next, which of course is a geographical impossibility. But you describe very clearly journeys, for example, out of Northway on Barton, down the Ring Road to Slade and things like that. So that's you've made an effort to be authentic in this case.
Well, yeah, and I've had to try to remember what the city centre looked like before they put in the new Westgate Centre, which now dominates things. So I've had to try to recall what things were like. I can remember the old Westgate. I can actually remember it before it was even covered. It was actually open air back in the 80s. But you've got this sequence towards the end of the book where the perpetrator I won't reveal who that turns out to be, is pursued through the streets of Oxford by this assailant that wants to take him out. And I've described the route that this individual takes and all the streets that he runs through to try and shake off his attacker. Initially, I had wanted to have a car chase through the centre of Oxford. I had in mind something akin to what we got in The French Connection and Bullet, these two classic movies that feature amazing car chases. And I thought, wouldn't it be incredible to do one of those through the centre of Oxford? And then I thought, well, maybe it's a little cliched to have a car chase because so many movies have had those. But what you don't often get is a chase on foot where somebody's just being desperately pursued and all they've got to rely on is their own two legs to run away from the situation. So that's what I put in there in the end. I hope people outside of Oxford don't get too put off by all these local references if they're not familiar with the city. I do consider it a fascinating city to have set the story in, though, far more so than most UK cities, because Oxford has a very colourful and checkered past. Obviously, it is something of a breeding ground for establishment elite types who will come to this place to get their education / training / indoctrination. So Oxford University is one of the breeding grounds for all these, elite types. It's Oxford and Cambridge are like the Harvard and Yale of England.
I think it's Oxford's probably the principal world training centre for the Illuminati, I would say.
Absolutely.
Really, when you consider the Rhodes Scholars come here and things like that, it's just incredible. And I mean, as far as the car chase goes, having a car chase in Oxford city centre is pretty much impossible anyway. You're lucky if you get 10 miles an hour.
That's true. That's very true.
But the actual chase is pretty good, and it I don't want to give spoilers out, but it involves some of the conspiracies that, say, Miles Johnston and the Basis Project talk about and things like that.
That's right.
And it also, another thing that comes up in this is in this fascinating city, and I've made videos about the city I live in, there's symbolism and things like that and the occult past. But one thing I've never covered, and I should, and you do, is the idea of underground tunnels. And I've heard rumours of these tunnels, that they exist, including the one in the book, but there's others. And you include this in the book, and it's amazing.
Yeah, well, that was partly based on things that I've heard. I've heard a legend of a tunnel that is supposed to link the Meter Inn with the Chequers Inn on either side of the high street. Supposedly there's a tunnel going back to antiquity that's down there somewhere. And there's this story of a group of monks that were walled up in the tunnel down there. I don't know if that's a myth. I kind of hope it is. But I extended that to create the idea of a secret hidden tunnel that goes from the Meter Inn all the way to Carfax Tower. So it lies underneath Carfax Tower and runs a section of the high street underneath the high street. So that is a fictional embellishment, but it's based on a legend and a myth that I have heard of.
It could be true. It wouldn't be surprising me if it's true, because that's about 300 yards, which is a long tunnel. But there's supposedly a tunnel at the Jolly Farmers. Now, I found this out. Well, I did go in there once. It's a gay pub, but I did drop in there once. Not that I'm part of their usual clientele, but the bar. It's a very old pub, actually. Long before it was a gay pub, it was just like a normal pub. And the barman actually said, he says, we've got like a tunnel in the cellar. It's just like we can't get into it. Someone got it open once and looked in, and they can't see how far it went. They shone a torch down it, and they can't see the end of it. And we didn't want to go in there because we thought it might not be safe. And I thought, I didn't ask. This was a few years ago now, but I think maybe go back there and just maybe they'll show me this place. I don't know. Maybe I could ask them if I could have a look at it. But there's rumours like this all the time. For example, you heard about the Bodleian Library? What's under the Bodleian Library?
I don't think so. No, what's that?
Well, it's a well-known fact. Some of there's a massive underground space underneath the Bodleian Library. For listeners who don't know, the Bodleian Library is one of the biggest libraries in the world. It houses millions of books. It's in central Oxford. It consists of two buildings on two sides of the street, very large buildings, but it also consists of a basement that is actually linked. The two buildings are linked together by a basement underneath Broad Street in Oxford, and this goes down 3 levels, I believe. Officially. Now, someone told me something quite amazing, that they had been in there. They'd actually been worked there once, and there is a vault down there which most of the librarians can't get into, because this is not a library you can wander around. You can't go in there and sort of like browse. If you were a member, you have access to the books. You go in there and you ask the librarians at a reception desk, and they go and get the book for you, and you read it in a reading room. So it's different from a public library.
Yeah.
But within the vault, there may well be perhaps some of the secret stuff that this secret order organization in the book deals with. Maybe it's like the Vatican Library.
Well, that's right. There's so many fascinating elements to Oxford. As we said, the Knights Templar were based here for a time, and you still have place names like Temple Cowley, which pay tribute to their time in the city. You've got the Martyrs Memorial right there on St Giles, just near Broad Street. There were 3 bishops who were burnt at the stake in 1500 and something for daring to defy the edicts of Queen Mary I. You've got the Ashmolean Museum, of course, which is full of Egyptian artefacts. Some of the finest Egyptian artefacts in the world that have been recovered are being held there. You've got the Randolph Hotel just over the road, where I've set this sort of thinly veiled Masonic ball that went on the, what do you call it, Beltane, 1st of May, May Day, May morning. So it is a very fascinating city to set a story in. No wonder Colin Dexter chose to base Inspector Morse there. So there's kind of elements of Inspector Morse in my story, I think. But what I've done is, as well as the academic and the respectable side of the city, the university aspect of things, I've also tried to portray the regular, everyday, mundane side of the city. So I've got some scenes set in Blackbird Leys, and I've described things like single mothers walking around smoking fags and chatting to each other at the bus stop, and a bunch of youths sat on a park bench passing around a spliff and a bottle of cider, and an old tramp hobbling around in front of one of the shop doorways. And these are very real sights that you do get in Oxford, but they're hidden from view. So most people that have never been to Oxford just think of the academic side of things that's portrayed in the likes of Inspector Morse. But you also have this gritty, raw, edgier side to the city. And so I've set parts of the story in those kind of locations just to show that, or to try and run the full spectrum of what life is like in Oxford for all kinds of communities.
I'm glad you did. I mean, this does exist, and I know it because I'm kind of part of that part of Oxford too. I'm not an academic. I've never been a student. I've never been.
You sit around on park benches smoking spliffs and drinking cider, though, right?
Not anymore.
Oh, okay.
maybe a few years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, but not anymore. But yeah, Barton, Blackbird Leys, these are the big council estates which I'm familiar with.
Well, every city has them.
Yeah, even
every city in the world has them.
Tourists, even the most touristy places on earth have these places where the ordinary folk live, the townies, as they call us. So right. I'm glad you included that. And again, we have another reference, I think, to the past, a bit of nostalgia. A pirate radio station on Barton.
Yes.
This is Verity's cousin who runs it.
That's right, Drew Hunter. So there's more wordplay there. Drew, as in he drew on a spliff, because one of his habits is he's a weed smoker. And he actually talks about drawing in spiritual knowledge and consciousness through the smoking of marijuana. So he's not someone that smokes just for shits and giggles. He's portrayed as a Rasta. You know, he adheres to that religion, and part of their doctrine involves the ceremonial smoking of marijuana, because they believe it's a plant medicine, it's a teacher, it comes from nature, it's a healer, and also it can bring knowledge. And his character is based on a lot of people. He's like an amalgamation of different people that I knew in Oxford back in the day, from Barton and Blackbird Leys, these sort of communities. And they really did speak the way he speaks, and they really did talk of getting knowledge from the ether, being able to tap into it. These people used to say that they never watched TV, they never read books, and yet they had a whole load of knowledge about what's really going on in the world. And it's true. Many of these people had a very good handle on things that the likes of us are talking about now in 2020, but back in the 1990s, they knew about the Illuminati, they knew about the New World Order, they knew about secret societies, they knew about the scam that is the fractional reserve banking system, and they were talking about this back then. And some of them even spoke to me about it back in the 90s, when in my ignorance I didn't pick up on it at all, and I didn't understand what they were saying because I just wasn't ready for all of that. But I can recall those conversations now. So there really were people like Drew Hunter, and although he only appears in a couple of scenes, he is quite key and quite pivotal to the story in terms of some of the things that he says. So most of the truth bombs that I drop in the book come through the words that are spoken by various characters. Obviously, there's Max Zeal, who delivers his lectures, but you get wisdom from listening to what the likes of Keith and Phil and Drew Hunter have to say as well, and also Amy Noble, who has a cameo in the newsroom. So Drew talks to Verity about how this number, which you mentioned earlier, 216, keeps cropping up. It's in her car license plate. It's her phone extension at work. She lives at 216B Abingdon Road. And she'd never noticed all these apparent coincidences until Drew pointed them out. And he makes the point that it's a message that's being delivered to her through creation, because her birthday is also the 21st of June, 216.
Summer solstice.
Exactly. So there's
shows how she's a special person. It gives her a sense that she's like fated, doesn't it?
It does.
There's something fateful about her. She's got
he talks to her about this. Yeah, he talks to her about how there's these different signposts that are placed in her path as she goes through her life, and it's a little confirmation from the universe that she's on the right path, and she's just got to keep going. And when she keeps seeing this number 216, which is an expression of her birthday, it's a confirmation that she's doing what she came here to do. And so the process that she goes through in the book was always meant to happen. That's what's hinted at here. And another thing is that by giving her the birthday of the summer solstice, I'm making a reference to the duality that exists everywhere in creation, because the sun is masculine in nature. It's everything in creation has masculine and feminine properties. And I never used to understand why, when you would study French and German at school, you would have words in French like le and la for masculine and feminine, and in German der, die and das. And certain words would be masculine and certain would be feminine. I thought, oh, why does that make any sense? We've just got the word the in English. And that, of course, is because English is designed to keep people dumbed down, and it's a bastardized language, and you get far more truth from looking at original languages like French and German. And when those languages were being put together, it was understood that there are polarities in nature, and there's masculine and feminine energy everywhere. So the sun is an expression of male energy, whereas the moon is its polarized counterpart, and that is feminine energy. And there are other aspects of Verity's character which evoke the moon. So she's a representation of the goddess figure in creation, the moon goddess. And Keith, her boyfriend, his nickname for it is Goddess. So often he just refers to her as Goddess.
He does, doesn't he? Yes.
Yeah, and there's also a couple of references to... Keith also goes through a transformation in the story, and he evolves in his consciousness. So at the start of the story, he's not particularly awake himself. He has to go through that transition. And he makes a couple of references, and there's a couple of references in the book to Verity being on her period, the time of the month. Now, people might think that's a very crude reference at first glance, but when we think of the process of female menstruation, that is linked to the cycles of the moon. And it's another confirmation that the moon is feminine in energy because of the way that it affects human female bodies. So that's like another little veiled allusion to Verity being an expression of the moon goddess. But then you've also got her birthday being on the summer solstice, linked to the sun. So she's got masculine elements to her character, and she's got feminine elements. And it's a little reminder to readers of how there's duality present everywhere in creation, in nature, and we see it expressed in everything.
Yeah, it's like she has a kind of what's the word? It's like she's found a balance between her anima and animus, are kind of in harmony rather than fighting.
Exactly. Yeah, it's
so she's a very
balancing
well-balanced person.
Of the different sides of her. Yeah, bringing it all into equilibrium.
I also, it's interesting that you Drew, the character Drew, actually similar to someone I used to know, in that, well, he appears in two scenes. I mean, it's not a spoiler to say this. He appears in two scenes, and in the second scene, he's very different to the first scene. You see a different side of him in the second scene, because in the first scene, I got the impression he's rather like this bloke I used to know. He was a black guy who lived he was quite conventional in many ways, but he had like dreadlocks, and I think he fancied himself as a Rastafarian, although I don't think he really went in for it seriously, and that he used to switch. Linguistically, he used to switch. He used to speak quite normally at one point, and then he'd switch to this Caribbean patois.
Oh, you knew someone that did that, right?
Yeah, I thought he was being I used to think he was a bit pretentious doing that. And Drew comes across like that in the first scene. But in the second scene, of course, you learn a lot more about him, and you learn he's actually a deeper and wiser person than he first appears to be. And the idea of the marijuana thing, drugs come up several times in the book, and I know you work your professional life, there is drugs involved in like music and dancing and things like that, and there's a scene in a rave. I mean, this is really nostalgic. This is, and things like that. But of course, marijuana is a natural drug that dates back to antiquity, and as you know, I mean, like the Rastafarians and many other people did derive spiritual enlightenment from it for many, many centuries before history began, and Drew, I think, the things he's come from pre-internet, has learnt all these things. And Max Zeal, Max Zeal is very similar, I think, because Max Zeal seems to have been through an experience that has led him to his kind of libertarian anarchist spiritual life that he's living now, lecturing. He gets kicked out the Pegasus. I mean, this is a little bit the kicking out the Pegasus Theatre. I don't know how anachronistic that is actually, because of course deplatforming happens all the time now. David Icke gets banned from Australia last year and things like that. But he ends up in the Blackbird Leys Community Centre after being kicked out of the Pegasus Theatre. But his background. You've talked about the things he talks about in the music industry, because he used to be a musician, didn't he?
That's right. I wanted to get some truth bombs in there about the music industry, and I worked out a way that I could do that was by giving Max Zeal a past as an aspiring musician. So this is the process that wakes him up and gets him on the path to studying the true nature of secret societies, who's really running this world and what's going on in this place and what the nature of life is in the first place. So it's revealed through a conversation that he has in the pub with Keith that back in 1977... So he would have been 20 back then. So if he's 20 in 1977, he's 33 when the story is set in 1990. Go figure. And he has a beard. So so back in 1977, he says he was in a band and they had high hopes of being the next Clash. They were a punk new wave band and they really wanted to make it big. And they got an offer from a very well-known record company and a very well-known manager in the industry of being elevated to levels of fame and success, but there was a price to pay. And the price to pay involved one of the band members performing an act with the manager in question. And Zeal makes it very clear that that wasn't this guy's kind of party. So it's left to the imagination of the reader as to how they make it very clear that they're not into that sort of thing. But that scuppers every chance they ever had of making it big as a household name in the music industry. So from that point forward, Zeal realises that he's never going to achieve his dreams of becoming a household name musician, and that makes him quite bitter and cynical, and it just sets him off on his path to research. And he tells Keith all the things that he's discovered about the true nature of the music industry, which is all the stuff that I put out in my Musical Truth books, basically, that the industry is run to a very large extent by paedophiles and Satanists, that if you want to make it big and become a household name, you have a very heavy price to pay. There are certain things that are going to be expected of you. You're going to have to attend these rituals and these parties and engage in all kinds of sordid, depraved acts. Oftentimes, the successful musicians that we get to hear of only get there because of the families that they come out of, because of, you know, who they are, what their backgrounds are. It's steeped in Freemasonry. There's occult ritualistic activity throughout the industry, and all these things are very, very true. You know, many of your favourite artists have undergone mind control programming and satanic ritual abuse. Unfortunately, there's a very real things. I do document them in my non-fiction books, but I wanted a way of getting these elements into the story of the book, and so I put that into the character of Max Zeal.
Yeah, it's this is something in a sense is a vindication for people like you and me, because it's actually being spoken about openly for the first time ever. But it is no doubt there is this. These big names you see, these famous people, everyone envies and everyone looks up to, have been through this ordeal. To get where they have to be, they have to go through this horrific ordeal. I mean, Bill Hicks makes jokes about this, doesn't he? I mean, I love Bill Hicks. He was a great comedian because he talks about the music industry, and he makes jokes about various famous artists having sex with Satan, basically, to get where they have to get. Right. And everyone laughed at him. He's a funny guy, but there's so much wisdom in there. Because, I mean, indeed, in chapter 19, you actually talk about things. You mention talking about Jimmy Savile. Now, this is not the music industry. Well, it is partly because he was a DJ, but it's also the TV and things like that. But, of course, people talking about Jimmy Savile in this particular, I think it was chapter 19. It was when the caller comes in and starts talking about all kinds of things. We have, of course, the revelations. It all comes out now, but we know that people were talking about it beforehand because of that outtake with Johnny Rotten.
Yeah.
From 1977 on the whistle test.
That's right.
And so it's what was once an open secret is now being spoken about openly, and hopefully, Mark, this is a way of actually putting an end to it.
Yeah, well, one of the inspirations behind writing the book was so that I could get so much truthful information across to people, but under the guise of fiction. So if ever I get attacked for any elements of it and people say, this was outrageous what you said and this can't be true and this is wrong, then I can always point to the fact that it's labelled as fiction and say, come on, man, it's just a fictional story. But those that are able to read between the lines will know that it's actually loaded with a whole bunch of truth. And I don't know if this is why Graham Hancock wrote his fiction. He just felt that it's a way of getting certain points and certain reflections across.
He did.
Yeah,
he actually said so.
Without getting attacked for it, because you know what it's like. The minute you make any kind of public statement on a YouTube video or a Facebook post, you immediately get a barrage of opinions. I don't agree with that. You've got this wrong. You should have done it this way. You should have said that. And I'm just so utterly sick and tired of all that I figured by putting out this information under the guise of fiction, I can deflect all of that and just point to it as fiction. But clearly there's a lot of truth in there. So everything that Max Zeal talks about with regard to the true nature of the music industry is verifiable and absolute truth, as I've documented. And you get that with many other aspects of the story as well. The Jimmy Savile thing, there was a beautiful piece of synchronicity there in that he actually got knighted by the Queen in June 1990, which is right in the middle of when the story is set. So I was able to weave that very real news event into the timeline of the story. So you got Neil Lowe, get it? Who's the detective inspector that's put in charge of these murder cases.
Oh, yes, I didn't notice that. I didn't get that clip bit, but yeah, right. I did. Yeah.
Well, all the names are coded. So Neil Lowe, he's a very servile man. He's very, very obedient to his overlords, and he does what he's told. And he's portrayed this way through the book. And he's a believer in the system. He believes in the legitimacy of the control system that we have.
He's... Sorry, carry on.
No, well, he looks up to government. He looks up to the Queen. He's very respectful of the royals. And so when Jimmy Savile got knighted by the Queen, he considered it was a great thing. And when May Pierce brings up the question of Jimmy Savile's... the sordid nature of the stories that we often hear about with Jimmy Savile. And this was going on back in 1990. You know, people were very suspicious of Jimmy Savile's true nature back in 1990. He was creepy and sleazy back then. But the official line was that he was this wonderful guy that did a lot of good work for charity, and that if there was anything dodgy about him at all, the Queen would not have knighted him because she doesn't go in for that sort of thing. Of course, we know rather different now, but back in 1990, that was the general public mindset. And so when May Pierce raises the question of Jimmy Savile being a bit dodgy, Neil Lowe immediately leaps to his defence and says, come on now, if there was anything wrong with him, the Queen wouldn't have knighted him.
Yeah, that happens at Randolph as well. I thought it was quite funny because she brings this up at the Randolph, because May Pierce is like, she's different. She's a different kind of policewoman because her brother's a conspiracy theorist and she's very awake. She's going through this awakening process because she and Verity become friends for that reason. That's right. Neil Lowe, I mean, it's interesting because there's these different characters. Indeed, you see it in The Office. You see it in the Fox FM office with Jess Hewitt and Tom Atten, because Tom Atten is like this he's like the journalistic equivalent of Lowe, isn't he? Because totally and utterly conformist, doesn't want to think about it, but he's being manipulated by Jess Hewitt, who is a malevolent person. There's a language clue there as well. But but you see the same thing with the police, because you have Nomas, who is a malevolent member of this organisation, this secret society, and he does what he does because he can manipulate people who shrug their shoulders and don't give a damn, the apathetic, obedient ones.
Yeah.
So you have the same system in both offices, the police and the media.
Yeah, so I've sort of juxtaposed the character of Verity with that of May. So I've got these two female lead characters, basically, and they're both going through a truth-seeking process. They're both discovering what this world is really all about. And with the story, I've kind of created a microcosm of the way the world is run and what goes on everywhere, and put it into Oxford. And so basically the whole story, with only a couple of exceptions, occurs within the Oxford Ring Road. And the idea is that the city of Oxford and all the people living in it represent the way the world at large is structured. So you have this secret society organisation that, it turns out, is pulling the strings of all these different institutions and all these different ways of life in Oxford. And that, of course, is what happens in the world. And so May comes to these discoveries in the same way that Verity does. So May is discovering corruption within the police, of which she's a part, and Verity is discovering that the same sort of thing is going on in the newsroom of the radio station, of which she is a part. So each of them is on their own individual journeys, and then at the end of the story they get together and become friends and sort of compare notes. So May, it becomes clear, was never really cut out for a career in the police. She's not what they're looking for. She's conscientious. She is not someone that just toes the line because it's the done thing. She questions things, and she puts her foot in it. She puts her foot in it with a badly judged comment at the Randolph concerning Jack the Ripper, and she puts her foot in it with the Jimmy Savile thing, and pisses off Neil Lowe, her boss, and it just becomes clear that she can no longer continue in the police because it's just not for her. And in the same way, Verity realises that her job as a reporter is not what she thought it was either. Tom Atten, that's another coded name, is someone who just goes through the motions and does exactly what is expected of him. And of course, he gets rewarded, if that's your idea of being rewarded, with a career at the BBC. So we find out at the end that he's become an anchorman on BBC Newsnight.
Doesn't that fit? Yeah.
Yes, and he fits in very well in the BBC because that's the kind of guy he is.
Yeah, and it just shows this bifurcation of people who I think everyone in their life is faced with this decision in this society we live in. Do you rebel or do you submit? I think it seems to be this is almost indicative of that choice that we all have to face.
That's right. And the characters in the book are going through that. And some of them just go along to get along and do what they need to do. And some of them are malevolent, as you say, and they have ulterior motives because they have affiliations to this secret society network. And then others are faced with moral dilemmas. And it's a question of, will they take right action in the world? Will they do the right thing, or will they just do the easy thing? And so we won't give too much away in terms of spoilers and stuff, but towards the end of the story there's a very real moral dilemma between two of the characters. I'm sure you know which part of the story I'm talking about, where this one person is faced with a very difficult decision and a very difficult choice to make. So will this person choose what they know to be right action in creation, or will they let other things sway them in their decision? I'll probably just leave that one there. Yeah,
but it's a real stickler. I remember I thought to myself, what would I do in that position? Caught between these two forces. And it's a Verity. Of course, this is another thing that I know happened to me. I believe happened to me, although I can't prove it. Is that when you do rebel you pay a professional price. You end up being hounded out of your job. And in her case it's very obvious. In my case it's a bit more nebulous, but she made the choice to rebel and not submit, and she was weeded out of the organisation. I mean, May Pearce, I know May Pearce, it was voluntary, but in a sense, she just jumped before she was pushed, didn't she, May?
Oh, yeah, she wouldn't have lasted much longer if she hadn't walked herself.
Yeah, and Verity, on the other hand, she does try to get... She really tries hard to let people know about what's going on. I mean, it's... I no doubt, I mean, obviously, if she'd succeeded in terms of, like, the recording and everything surviving, she'd now be labelled a famous conspiracy theorist. She'd probably be the new David Icke, wouldn't she?
Yeah. Well, Verity and Keith and Phil and May are all kind of early examples of conspiracy theorists, way before their time. So they are anachronisms. They were going through these processes in 1990 when very few people were. I mean, just think, David Icke hadn't even got going in 1990. Mm-hmm. He hadn't even started putting out his world-changing books. So how many people were there in the world, and you can whittle that down to in Oxford, that had any kind of knowledge of the truth of what goes on in this world? 99.5% of people were probably just swallowing whatever the BBC told them and listening to what government ministers said and reading newspapers and getting their worldview from all that.
Yeah. And you have I mean, there's another guy, another character. He's only a minor character who doesn't really appear on scene, but he's... I think you've based him on a real person, and this is Simon Ops MP, known as Cy for short.
Yeah, Cy for short. Yeah,
that's a great one. That is. Yeah.
I was going to call him Simon Coe, Cy Coe, but I ended up with Cy Ops instead.
But the real Cy Ops is he was actually Tony Blair's education secretary, and he was one of these automaton people. He was one of these people who he was a careerist politician and just went along with it. He was our MP for like years and years and years.
Actually, Simon Ops was just a fictional creation. I didn't have anyone specific in mind when I created him. I just wanted a corrupt politician, basically.
Right.
There's plenty to choose from.
Oh, I see. Okay. Apologies, Andrew Smith. But yeah.
Well, no, a very interesting observation there, because I didn't have him in mind. But, like I say, when you're looking for corrupt politicians, there's really no shortage.
Yeah, Andrew Smith was a typical, Blairite. He was actually Blair's education secretary, and he was our MP. And he supported the wars that broke out and things like that.
Of course he did.
Yeah, so... Anyway, are you planning on writing any more? Because I mean, I'd love to. We've been going for over an hour, Mark, and we could probably go for another hour. But of course, I've got to interview someone else soon. So,
sure.
But I'd love to bring you back and say more. We could maybe talk some more on this another time. And also, are you planning on writing any more books, fictional or non-fictional?
Well, yeah, I am. I created an epilogue in this book, which I set in 1996. So I wanted to show what happened to each of the characters long term. So the main bulk of the story finishes in spring 1991, and then it picks up in spring 96, 5 years later. And so there's some closure there in terms of letting people know what happened to the characters based on the choices that they made. So this is bringing in karma and consequentialism, cause and effect. So each of the characters, in terms of how they end up, it's as a direct result of the choices that they've made and the behaviours that they've employed in their lives. And you could argue that a couple of the characters got off quite lightly in terms of the things that they did. They didn't pay as heavy a price as they might have done, so I accept that is the case with a couple of them. But with some of the other characters, what happens to them is the inevitable result of the choices that they made, because everything is a free will choice. And there are, positive outcomes for certain characters, and there are very negative outcomes for others. So that's where I left things in 96. I've put what I hope is a bit of a surprise twist ending right at the end of the story that people might not have seen coming. And I've left things open for a sequel, because I did have in mind... Again, this is looking at what you did with your trilogy of books, and you took the story out in 3 parts. And I looked at that and thought, well, maybe there's more that can be explored here. Maybe I can do more with this fictional genre and these characters that I've created. So I do have in mind a sequel. I I don't know what it's going to be called yet, but some of the characters from this book will pop up again in the sequel. Verity and Keith clearly will. May is going to. Max Zeal is going to. And I have the idea that this sequel is going to be set in 2001 at the time of 9/11, which is 5 years after the epilogue of this first book from 96 through to 2001. And I have in mind that it's going to address the idea of false flag terror events,
right,
which are made to happen to achieve certain aims. So that's going to be the crux of the story. And I think that's something I would like to do, just take the story further, because I think there's more that can be done with this genre now.
Definitely, yeah. I think I'd sense the open-ended nature of the ending, which of course is what I mean, I didn't actually have in mind a sequel when I was writing Roswell Rising, but by the time I was getting close to the end, I did leave it open. And I mean, there's a lot more perhaps we could talk about another time. Like, for example, you bring up the idea of, you mentioned like marijuana and things, but you also address other drug-related issues, and the scene where there's the CIA people at the party at the Goa rave.
Yes, that's right.
And that's another. I know you've addressed this in your non-fictional work, and you do touch on that in this particular book. But there's so much more we could talk about, Mark. But I recommend people do go out and get it. Now, how much does it cost, this book?
Well, I've got this one on for £10, so it's on Amazon for £10. I'm also selling copies myself, so if anyone wants a signed copy, they are welcome to reach out to me, and I can post out signed copies anywhere in the world. You just got to drop me an email to markdevlinuk@gmail.com, and I can do that.
Right, and are you appearing at any conferences or other lectures you're doing anywhere? Because it'd be good to meet up with you again, and you can sign my copy.
Well, yeah, we must do that at some point. I'm actually going to Australia next month. I'm participating in 3 conference events there. So I'm going to be in Brisbane on Thursday the 19th of March, then Sydney on Saturday the 21st of March, and in Perth on Sunday the 22nd of March. And something I realised the other day is that when I'm there in Perth, it's going to be exactly 30 years since the start of this story. So The Cause and the Cure opens on the 22nd of March, or the night of the 21st, going into the 22nd of March. That's 322. It's the spring equinox. And so I'm going to be delivering this talk in Perth exactly 30 years after this story starts, which is kind of interesting. So I'm doing that. I'm doing one in the States at the end of May. This is called Seed for Growth. It's taking place in Athens, Ohio, and that is from the 29th to the 31st of May. So I'm going to be there alongside Mark Passio is headlining at that one, and Sean McCann's going to be there, Nathan Redette, Brandon Martin, a whole bunch of others. UK conferences, not sure how quick you're going to get this show out, but next Thursday, the 6th of February, I'm doing a talk for Keep Talking in London, and this is going to be mind control in James Bond movies. Kind of topical, because the new Bond film is due out very soon. And then I'm taking that one up to Truth Juice in Birmingham on the 10th of March, Tuesday 10th of March. I'll be doing the James Bond talk up there. So other than that, well, that's what's going on conference-wise for me in the coming weeks anyway.
Well, I do hope to see you at all of those events. I'd love to go to the Keep Talking one, actually, but unfortunately I've got to do my show that day, and it's a good one. I mean, it's a good one to go to, and I do hope to see you at some obviously I won't be able to get to some of these events, but if I see one of them, I will. Well,
I might not see you in Australia, eh?
Well, if we don't get banned, Mark.
Well, yeah, I mean, anything can
Fingers
happen,
crossed.
Yeah. But, anyway, I can tell you've read the book very thoroughly, mate. I want to thank you for that, because you've come with some great insights, some great questions, and I can tell that you really delved into it. So I definitely appreciate you having this discussion with me.
Oh, you're very welcome. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, good, really good. Very, very on my sort of level, and on the level of people who are interested in these sorts of things. There's not a lot of fiction out there for our kind of folk, I think, and this is one of them.
And also, I've got the subplot running through the book of the rave acid house scene as well, which was very much in effect in 1990. So anyone with any memories of what rave culture was like in the UK is going to enjoy the subplot, I feel, and some of the characters that we've got there. So that's it's another little piece of truth. Actually, I think this genre that we're in, Ben, with your books and with what I'm doing and other people, should be termed truth fiction. I think it should be a new genre called truth fiction, because we're dropping a whole lot of truthful knowledge through these narratives. There's some fictional embellishments, but for the most part, it's truth.
It's a good way. I think it's a good way of getting real information across. I mean, George Orwell, of course, I think very much inspired me with 1984 and Animal Farm, where he brought real concepts across through the sphere of allegorical fiction. And who knows, Mark, one day you might walk into Blackwell's and there'll be a shelf which says truth fiction on it, and you'll find 1984, you'll find Roswell Rising, you'll find The Cause and the Cure, and hopefully lots and lots of other books of those natures.
Fahrenheit 451.
Yes, so you'll have Graham Hancock's fictional works, which he actually, Hancock, to be fair to him, I should add something I said earlier, he does improve, actually. His fiction improves as he matures. So we'll have all those there.
He must have done some more ayahuasca.
I think he did, yeah. But, I'd love to talk some more, obviously listen to the music as well. I mean, I've listened to songs. Well, while I was reading this, I put a few songs on. I mean, I used to love that music of that era. The rave, you mentioned the rave scene, and you have, bands like The Shaman and the KLF, who I absolutely adore, and all the other bands you mentioned, Guru Josh and a couple of other people here. I mean, really, it is a Sonne Lumiere kind of experience. It's multimedia. So read the book, listen to the chat, listen to tunes.
We should probably just mention the soundtrack if we can. So I've created a 2-hour sonic journey which really takes you inside the story. It's available on my Spreaker page, so you can stream or download it for free from there. And it consists of music that was around in 1990 that helps to tell the story. And some of the tracks are actually mentioned in the narrative of the book, and some of the artists are mentioned. It was the year that Mariah Carey broke through, and there's a conversation that takes place there where somebody's hearing Mariah Carey for the first time, and they say, "Oh, who's that? Whitney Houston?" Because everyone used to think she sounded like her. That's a very real conversation that took place in the radio station. And then I've included little snippets of news from the time, little radio news bulletins and little excerpts from radio shows. So it really is 1990 and 91 all over again when you listen to that. So I just wanted to mention that the soundtrack is available for free, and people might want to have that as an accompaniment to the book.
Definitely. Well, there'll be a link in the show notes where you can buy the book, and indeed there'll be a link to the soundtrack as well. So listeners, please do check those out. I do recommend this book. It's really, really good. It's a great debut novel from Mark Devlin. So Mark, thanks very much. It's been good to talk to you again, and I wish you all the best for your tours, and hope to catch up with you again soon. So thanks for being on the HPANWO show.
Thanks for having me on. And you came up with the best line yet that I've seen in a review for the book, where you said, "If Colin Dexter, Robert Anton Wilson and Agatha Christie ever got together for a saucy threesome, then their mutant offspring would produce this charismatic tale." That is the best PR line I've heard, so thank you for that.
Oh, you're very welcome, Mark. In later editions, feel free to put it on the cover in quotes.
Oh, I may well just do that, yeah.
Oh, well, it's really good to talk to you again, and you take care, mate.
All right, cheers, man.